So Wil.
Good evening, and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Katie from Greenlight, and we're thrilled to host tonight's event with Wil Haygood, launching his new book, Colorization, 100 Years of Black Films in a White World. He will be talking with director Michael Schultz, so you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to Wil, Michael, and the team at Knopf for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up. Although we're not able to host events in our store spaces, our community of authors and readers is still here. We're grateful for your support and for the chance to make space for conversation and connection. Before we get started tonight, there's just a few housekeeping things to go over. In our Zoom webinar, you can see and hear the speakers, but they can't see or hear you. They can see that you're here though, and there are a couple of different ways that you can interact with the authors and with each other throughout tonight's event, which we highly encourage. The first is the chat, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like one speech balloon. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat. It's a great way to show your appreciation for the author and to interact with fellow attendees. So if you have a specific question you'd like to have answered by the author, please post that in the Q&A module. You can find by clicking it on the icon that looks like two speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions only from the Q&A to be answered in the later part of the program, so please make sure you're putting your questions there and not in the chat. And importantly, tonight's featured book, Colorization, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. You can shop in person from 10 a.m. to 7 p.m. at both our Fulton Street and Flatbush Ave stores, where you can purchase Wil's book and many others on site. You can also order online at greenlightbookstore.com for a quick pickup in the store or for shipping anywhere in the US. I'll be dropping the buy link in the chat in just a moment. If you care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. Our interviewer tonight is Michael Schultz. Schultz's influential career has spanned more than 4 decades, during which he has directed feature films, movies for television, children's programming, and episodes of television's most popular series, including Blackish, Star, New Girl, My Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, All American, and more. As one of the first African-American directors hired by the major studios, Michael Schultz forever changed the game by opening doors for directors of color. He will be speaking with our featured author, Wil Haygood. Wil Haygood is a former Boston Globe, where he was a Pulitzer Prize finalist, and Washington Post reporter. Haygood has received writing fellowships from the Guggenheim, National Endowment for the Humanities, and Alicia Patterson Foundations. His biographies of Adam Clayton Powell Jr., Sammy Davis Jr., Sugar Ray Robinson, and Thurgood Marshall have been widely acclaimed. Haygood also wrote the New York Times bestseller, The Butler, A Witness to History, which was adapted into an award-winning movie. Haygood is currently serving an appointment as Broadway visiting distinguished scholar at his alma mater, Miami University in Ohio. Haygood's new book, Colorization, is an important, timely history of Black cinema, looking at 100 years of Black movies, from Gone with the Wind to Blaxploitation films to Black Panther, and using the films and the struggles and triumphs of their artists as a prism to explore Black culture, civil rights, and racism in America. Wil is going to start us off with a reading from the book, and then he will be talking with Michael and with all of you. Please take it away, Wil and Michael.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here, especially with the iconic movie director, Michael Schultz. I'm going to start by reading a little section from the book that talks about the uprising against the 1915 movie, The Birth of a Nation, which was a very racist film that portrayed the Ku Klux Klan as heroes in the Deep South. So here goes. In May 1915, a group of Black ministers in Chicago heaped scorn upon the movie. In February 1916, Iowa ministers banded together and passed a resolution against the movie. There were also demonstrations in St. Louis and many other cities. Between 1915 and 1916, when The Birth of a Nation was filling American movie theaters, the nation's population was a little over 100 million. Thomas Dixon, the author of the novel that the movie was based on, had estimated that 20 million people would see The Birth of a Nation. His estimate turned out to be low. More than 25 million eventually saw the film during its first run. quarter of the population had it drilled into them from a movie screen that Blacks were criminal-minded, stupid, lazy, obsessed with white women, and malevolent. In some parts of the South, high school teachers began using The Birth of a Nation as a text, indoctrinating students with its telling of history. In the summer of 1919, 4 years after The Birth of a Nation had its official opening, a wave of race riots swept the nation. The episodes were beyond horrendous. Many stemmed from confrontations between whites and Black veterans of World War I. On so many fronts, Black Americans were beaten down politically and legally. And cinema had now achieved a new place in society with a nation-shaking film that Blacks found abhorrent. Their leaders and advocates could do nothing to halt the movie's ongoing popularity and social influence. The Birth of a Nation was big business in America. During its first run, the movie grossed between $50 and $60 million. Men got rich and careers were indelibly made. The Birth of a Nation even helped change the dynamics of how America went to the movies. Theater owners began keeping theaters open with longer hours. They started realizing more than ever that snacks at their concession stands would help them make even more money. But all of this had been done at a terrible price to Black America. It seemed as if Blacks had yet one more enemy: cinema. If Black Americans were to fight against what cinema had now done to them, they would need their own filmmaker. They needed someone to tell their stories with nuance and honesty and respect and comedy and joy, all the things that this magical thing called cinema was offering to mainstream society. And if such a person were to emerge, he would have to possess fortitude and a wide vision that would remain steadfast against the forces sure to rise and be arrayed against him. Thank you.
It's a great book, Will. And the fact that you spent how many years working on it? 4 years working on this and getting the idea to write it in the first place. Can you tell our audience what sparked you to start researching this book?
Mm-hmm. You know, I think in a way it started when I was a kid, you know, in a strange way. In the 1960s, when I was a kid, my mother in Columbus, Ohio, she would give me 50 cents every Sunday to go to the movies. And these were my first forays alone outside of my home. And I went to the Garden Theater on North High Street. And here I am, 8, 9, 10, 11 years old, sitting there looking up at a 60-foot wide screen. It really was the magic of cinema. And the stars that I looked at and fell in love with were Doris Day, Liz Taylor, Lee Marvin, Robert Mitchum, Paul Newman, Yul Brynner, and all these people had one thing in common. They were all white. I never at the Garden Theater as a kid saw a Black actor on that screen. Then I went away to college in the 1970s. And when I would come home for the summers, there was a movie theater downtown called the Southern Theater, and they were showing Black movies. Shaft, and Truck Turner and Superfly and Foxy Brown. And it showed me that there were two different mindsets when it came to cinema. You saw more whites in the Black films than you saw Blacks in the white films. And so, you know, one could look around the world on the movie screen and not really see very many Blacks. So I go on in life and I become a newspaper writer, and I write this story about this White House butler who worked in the White House under 8 presidents, and it ends up on the front page of the Washington Post newspaper. And he came out of segregation, of course, and Gene Allen, and he lived to see the nation elect its first African-American president. And I wrote this big story about him, and then Hollywood bought the rights to the story. And so I'm down in New Orleans on the movie set with Oprah Winfrey and Forrest Whitaker and Vanessa Redgrave and Jane Fonda and Robin Williams, just a great multiracial cast. And one night there was a soiree hosted by the film's director, Lee Daniels. And as I'm looking around the house, and I just said to myself, wow, someone needs to write about this moment. Cinema history, Black and white actors and actresses who really wanted to make this movie. They all took pay cuts, lower salaries than what they would usually get. And what a moment. And I just really kind of said it. And then Terrence Howard, the actor, he was also in the movie. He walked over to me and he looked at me and he said, "You're the writer, so you ought to write that book." And so I really think that the seed happened to have been planted then, but it was connected to my love of films when I was a kid.
Right, right. I had pretty much the same experience because, you know, aside from Clarence Muse, who was the one Black actor in the very first talking motion picture, you didn't see any Black actors. You know? And then when you started to see somebody appear on screen, it was Hattie McDaniels, you know, doing Aunt Jemima or whatever. And so you didn't want to see that as a kid, you know?
Right.
You wanted to see the real deal. And the real deal was going to take years and years to come about.
Right.
In all of your research and covering this span of 100 years, what was your key takeaway from, in terms of the power of cinema and the people who hold on to that power, and how it started to loosen up, or how we started to get involved?
I'm still amazed at those people who stuck with the climb. It's hard to make it in the movie business. And you know, it's hard for Asians, for Blacks, for whites. It's just a hard battle. It's just a high hill to climb. And one of the things that I found haunting, I don't know if that's the right word, sad is certainly the right word, is that there were so many actors and actresses like Canada Lee, whose name you know, Canada Lee. there were some very great actors who died young in their late 30s, early 40s, or mid 50s. And I would finish a section about somebody who died, an actress like Diana Sands. Diana Sands, great stage actress and appeared in films, you know, but there were so many of these people who died before they were able to see the nation change, before they saw the 1964 Civil Rights Bill, 1965 Civil Rights Bill, 1968 Housing Bill. They lived to make people think, or to make people enjoy the magic of cinema. They loved the country more than the country loved them. And I think that that has really stuck with me, that there were these great talents who wanted to act and they died too soon. Maybe it was heartache, bad habits, you know, who knows, but you know, the stress of wanting to perform with everything you have in you, every atom in your body, and not having an outlet for that must have been very painful.
Not being able to get that job and not being able to see any parts that were written for your talent.
Right, yes. You know, talk about the writers, right, who wanted to write screenplays. Nobody was making those movies in the 40s and the 50s and even most of the 60s. I mean, you know, so it was hard to always be on the outside. Right. These people were always, you know, always on the outside. That makes your own journey so astounding. You got on the inside early. I mean, and, you know, so folks could see you working, making these seminal movies like Car Wash, like Which Way Is Up, like Bustin' Loose. I mean, people could see that and they could look up to that.
Right.
That was wonderful.
Well, my inspiration, I wanted to be a director before Black directors came on the scene, except for Oscar Micheaux, of course, who I knew nothing about. My education, basically a whitewashed education. So you never, ever heard about Oscar Micheaux, you know?
Right.
And when I decided that that's what I wanted to do, was tell these stories and be able to direct and tell stories about our people in a way that hadn't been told before. I'm in the Midwest with no outlet, no ability to pay for film school, you know.
Right.
So I'm sitting in the back of a little theater, just like you in Ohio. I'm in Madison, Wisconsin, as a sophomore in college, watching all these great filmmakers from Europe or Asia, Kurosawa and Antonioni and Fellini, and who were telling stories that weren't Hollywood type stories, right? And I said, man, I wish I could do that. And the closest I could get to it was theater. So I got my training in theater, which was the best thing that could ever happen. Because when I got to New York, my theory was if I make a rep as a director in theater, somebody will hire me to make a movie.
Right.
And that's exactly what happened. But I had the training, I had the tools, I could do whatever needed to be done. I could act, I could dance if that needed to happen. I hated doing all of that stuff.
Right.
I could design lights, you know, but I was equipped to do whatever it took for me to get to that level, right?
Right.
Then in college, Melvin Van Peebles and Gordon Parks show up.
Yep.
And Melvin shows up outside of the system and proves that there's a huge Black audience that exists that Hollywood is missing out on.
Right.
And Gordon is working inside of the system because he's got all the tools. He's a brilliant photographer and a writer and a musician and all of that. And both of them found that they could not really give their true voices because they always had to funnel their stories through what I call the white sieve. Right? And they were the kind of men who just would not, they run up against that resistance and then just blow up, just say, I'm not taking this shit,
Right. I know it.
So, but they inspired me. I said, man, if they can do it, I can do it,
And you did.
And I watched how Hollywood really kind of moved them out of the game.
Right.
And I said, okay, I have to be a little bit more psychologist, a little bit more of a therapist, a little bit more of a diplomat, and still get what I want,
Right.
Make them think that they did it.
Right.
So it's very interesting. So when I did Cooley High, which you write about, it was a change of that whole Blaxploitation road that the studios were on because they were milking that to death.
Right.
And when I saw that script, that story, I said, man, these are real kids. This is a real Black story. And the Blacker I can make it, the more I think it will cross over, that will appeal to more than just the Black audience.
Yeah.
So you want to talk about how that film hit you?
Yes. Me and my friends had fallen in love with the beach movies. Those
Beach Blanket Bingo.
Annette Fonciello and all those movies. We just like the fast movement of those movies, and these were kids. They were teenagers, mostly in high school, but we had never had a high school movie with Black students showing their joy, their madcap hijinks, and all that. So when that movie came out, when Cooley High came out with that lovely soundtrack, we were transfixed. We went to see it 2 and 3 and 4 times because we could relate. Cinema had never up to that point really offered a diet of films that we could choose from. And so that was such a seminal movie. It was sweet, it was tender, it was heartbreaking in some places. It was just vital to us to see that movie. Lawrence Fishburne, and then there was Glenn Turman, there was Cynthia Davis, there was Garrett Morris. It was just vital to us to see people who look like us on screen. And, not many of us knew who you were, but we later found out and said, wow, he did Cooley High. I mean, that really gave you big time props.
Because of my name, everybody thought I was Jewish, right?
Yeah.
I just want to want to show your book so that when people go in the bookstore, they know how to grab it.
Oh, thank you.
So this is the book that we're talking about. Colorization. What is colorization? What does that mean?
Oh, that's a great question. It flows from the different stanzas that Black cinema went through. It was colored, starting with the silence, then the movies in the 30s, the skin tone, the very dark-skinned maids who were always cast, and then you had the sepia tone movie stars in the 50s, Harry Belafonte, Dorothy Dandridge, and so it offers you some insight about the eras that the filmmaking process went through. And I would just like to mention the people on the cover of the book: Sidney Poitier, Harry Belafonte, Oscar Micheaux, Hattie McDaniel, Pam Grier, Dorothy Dandridge, Gordon Parks, Billy D. Williams, and Spike Lee.
How come I'm not up there?
Yeah, that's my bad. That's my bad. I mean, but you are certainly written about.
Go ahead.
Yeah. And so I think that these people helped color cinema. Without them, cinema would look very, very, very different than it does right now. Cinema is a big art form. We make a lot of money overseas with our movies. It's a gigantic cultural art form in this country, and people all over the world ask us about our movies.
Right.
Yeah.
It's something that people in this country don't understand, which I think your book really brings out, is the power of the image. It can change a nation. It can change people's thoughts, because you are really in people's heads when you got them in a dark theater.
Right.
You are projecting whatever those images are.
Right.
You're right inside their heads. And that's one thing that a lot of white and Black filmmakers maybe didn't understand, that how important those images are, because you are actually creating behavior in the audience by putting those models up there.
You are so right, especially when you think of this. In the 50s, the country was very segregated. The 60s, still segregated. The 70s, still mostly segregated as far as where people lived. And so many people would go to the theater, and that image of someone Black, Harry Belafonte, Sidney Poitier, on screen, that in their mind was someone speaking for the whole race.
Right.
Even if they weren't really speaking for the whole race, somebody could walk out of the theater and think that. I was a foreign correspondent on newspapers, and I traveled overseas a lot. And often, if I was in a nation that was mostly white, and I was having dinner with someone, and I'm talking like in the 1990s, late 1990s, somebody invariably would ask me if all Blacks in America had guns. And I said, why in the world would you think that? Heavens no. And they said, well, because when I watch your movies, all the blacks always have guns and they're always shooting. So just like you said, that image goes a long way and it carries a powerful message. I mean, I think that's why Sidney Poitier in the movie Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, you know, he is engaged to a woman who is white, and they have one kiss during the whole movie. His fiance, who he loves, she loves him. They're getting ready to get married. One measly little peck. And that was what, in the power brokers in Hollywood, that was as much as they thought that society could stand. Whoa, you know, this black man with this beautiful blonde, never mind that this black man was a Rhodes Scholar, right, and had all kinds of credentials. The attitude swimming off of that screen was that this black man had to be overwhelmingly stellar, had to be like Othello and Shakespeare, all rolled up into one to deserve her.
Be in the same room, not necessarily to deserve her. I don't think that ever was. You know?
Yeah, to be in the same room. And so the filmmaking, when it comes to race in Hollywood, has lagged behind what is happening out on the streets. There have been multiracial couples eons and decades, but cinema didn't dare walk up that road. And so I think that cinema has a lot of catching up to do with what's really happening in this country. And things have certainly gotten better in the past, 3-4 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, it was really eye-opening for me when I was trying to get my movie, even though they were coming out of the Hollywood machine, it still had to go through the white mindset,
Right.
When the studio saw when the people who market the films at the studio saw a car wash, they said, how do we sell this? It's a black movie.
Yeah.
And I said, you mean you didn't see all the white people in the movie?
Yeah, exactly. Good point. Yep.
And it was just because a lot of the marketing people were from the South, right? So they come to it with their own set of biases and prejudices, figuring out nobody's going to want to see this.
Right. Right.
And they market it in that way. So a lot of really good black films, unlike Car Wash, never got the distribution that they deserve because of the marketing bias of the people who had to sell the movie. So for a long time, it was a multifaceted problem, because you'd find a white producer or a studio that would make the movie, but then within their organization, they had all these channels that they had to go through that, they really had to champion that movie. For example, even as recently as Black Panther, if there had not been a black executive in the ranks of Marvel, that movie never would have gotten made.
Right. Yep.
It took somebody in the room,
right,
who knew what they were doing, who had the power of persuasion with the rest of all the white board members,
Right.
saying this is going to work. You know?
Right. Right.
In order for it to even see the light of day. So that's why it's taken so long to get stories that relate to real people,
Hmm.
real heroes. You know, it's like
Right.
even a superhero, Black Panther, very important images to put out there
Right.
for everybody, not just Black audience.
Well, yeah. My goodness. The folks who wanted to make the Butler movie, they had the studio dropped it, who had optioned it. And then Sheila Johnson and Laura Ziskin, they both went about raising the money with Lee Daniels. And so here's, they had to go out and raise the money themselves, and they got like about 40 investors to raise the money to make the movie. And then it opened #1 at the box office. #1 at the box office for the first week, the second week, and the third week. And we're talking about a movie that Hollywood did not want to make. And it stayed in the top 10 for like the first 8 weeks. And it made money. It made everybody money. There was a study that came out a couple of years ago, and I write about it in the book, that Hollywood leaves billions of dollars on the floor because they do not make diverse movies.
Yeah.
So money is left on the floor, and they often say, oh, we really don't care if it's black or white. We want to make money. No business, no show. As that quip goes. But look at the Black Panther. I mean, it knocked Hollywood in the world for a loop.
Right.
And the kids and the teenagers, white, in Germany, in Russia, in Spain, and France, they will go see Black artists. They will. We have to give them the movies, and the boardrooms in Hollywood have to have more color. They just do. More colorization in those boardrooms, in those marketing meetings. That means something.
Exactly. You want to read a section from your book about Diana Ross?
Yes, she was a great singer with the Supremes, and then one of the movies that also influenced me as a teenager, a young man, was Lady Sings the Blues. Diana Ross played Billie Holiday. And so here goes. And so they began screaming her name. Diana! She turned, and the cameras would flash, catching her movie star smile. Her shoulders were broad, her waist was so thin, and she looked dazzling in her clothes, as stylish as any Black fashion model on any runway. She was becoming a pop princess and a pop icon all at once. Diana! The Supremes performed on the soundtrack for The Happening, a silly 1967 counterculture movie that starred George Maharis, Michael Parks, Milton Berle, and Faye Dunaway. Kids and guns and mistaken identities and hijinks. Their song, The Happening, was yet another #1 hit. There were growing rumors that Diana Ross might leave the group. To keep her in the fold, Berry Gordy realized concessions would have to be made. So one more name change. Now it was Diana Ross in the Supremes. Like most everyone, Berry Gordy loved the movies. but he complained that Hollywood didn't understand the breadth and scope of Black stories, of Black storytelling. The Blaxploitation movies to him were mere romps geared toward Black audiences with hopes that whites might become intrigued and add to the box office. His Motown was different. Whites had waltzed into its web effortlessly and intended to stay. He had turned the label into a crossover juggernaut. Singers from the label, Michael Jackson, the Supremes, had already sung on white movie soundtracks, and their theme songs had become hits. Berry Gordy, reclining in his Motown office chair, started thinking of Hollywood, a place where not a single Black executive had the power to greenlight a movie. None of that mattered to him. He made up his mind he was going to get into the damn movie business. He wanted to make movies with Diana Ross, because Ross was more than just the supremely talented lead singer of the Supremes. She had become Berry Gordy's lover. As the song went, quote, "Love is like an itching in my heart." Period.
Indeed, indeed. The thing that was interesting is that he got that movie made through the sheer force of his showmanship, you know, and his ability to deal in Hollywood. But she was totally unlike Billie Holiday, you know?
Totally, yes, yes,
Uh,
yes, yes.
So the film that you worked on with Lee Daniels, I thought that Audrey Day, is that her name? Yeah, was incredible.
Oh, yes, yes. She was in the United States versus Billie Holiday, who was
Right.
nominated for an Oscar.
Right.
Yeah, she was.
She was brilliant.
Yeah.
I see a couple of questions in the Q&A that maybe we should tackle.
Okay.
While other people send their questions in by pressing the Q&A button and typing their question, and then we'll try and answer them.
Okay.
So the first one is from Vic White. Can you explain the genesis of the term Blaxploitation films?
Yes, I can. Yes. In response to movies like Superfly and Coffee and Foxy Brown, there were some people who thought that the movies were too risque. You know, there was nudity, there was sex, there was drinking. They were entertainments, they were movies. And so an NAACP official in Los Angeles had told several newspapers that he didn't like the movies. He said that they were exploiting Blacks. And he coined the phrase Blaxploitation. And the phrase stuck. At first, it wasn't seen by many people who were going to those movies. They didn't really let the phrase stop them. But then years later, I think, when scholars started honing in on that phrase in those movies, it seemed like the terminology, like the phrase, suddenly became something negative. But we have to realize, before then, there had been no 4 or 5 year wave of Black films in this country. So yes, the movies were made very quickly. You know, some of them looked cheap because the studios never gave those filmmakers lavish budgets. But it was a way for actors to learn the craft, for filmmakers to get credits to go on to make more movies. And so I have 2 whole chapters in this book about that period, focusing on the men and the women, because when we look back, it was important. A lot of stellar talents came out of that milieu. Pam Grier and Max Julian, Ron O'Neill, Yaphet Kotto. I mean, it was just a lot of wonderful, wonderful talent and that came out of that era.
Yep, it was great. Did the Oscars So White movement result in sustained improvement, in your opinion?
Yes, I think now Hollywood went through that period with the Oscars So White. 2014, there were no Black nominees. 2015, there were no Black nominees. It was shameful. It was awful. And the movie business ended up on page 1 of newspapers all around the world for the wrong reasons. They did not want to be on page 1 for that reason. And here you have a place that is supposedly liberal, and this happens 2 years in a row. And there have always been white and executives who have fought hard to make movies more representative of this country. You know, you go back in the 50s and 60s, Ralph Nelson, Stanley Kramer, there just have never been enough of them. But I think now that the movement has been unleashed, and I think that movement is here to stay.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it made a huge impact on the mentality of Hollywood, realizing that, you know, the Academy consisted of basically old white men.
Yeah.
So it was an old boys club, just like most corporations
Right.
have been up until recently. And so they realized that in order to change anything, you have to start at the top and colorize the top, and then
Right.
then things start changing, you know?
Yep, you're exactly
So
right.
that has definitely happened with the Academy. When I did Cooley High, we had one original song in it.
Mm-hmm.
The song at the end is So Hard to Say Goodbye.
Oh, yeah.
And we submitted it for Academy Award, and they just would not even deal with it. Although it met all the requirements, to them, it was a Black song, and there was no way it was going to qualify for the Academy Award. You know?
Yeah.
So that kind of thinking doesn't change until you change the thinkers.
Right. You're exactly right.
So anyway, there's a few participants who have any questions, and I'm wondering if, because they don't know how to type.
Okay.
So Greenlight, come to the rescue.
Yeah, it looks like that's all the questions that we have for right now. So if you want to continue just chatting a little bit while we wait for other attendees to write some questions. And if you don't know how to use the Q&A feature, feel free to pop your questions in the chat, and I'd be happy to take them there as well.
There is one more section, Michael, that I would love to read, which speaks to this very moment that you had mentioned about Hollywood and change in this year that we are in. Okay.
Great. Mm-hmm.
So I'll read one more section. And this is about the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd that woke up this nation in a way that it had never been awakened since the 1960s.
Mhm.
So they kept marching. They marched down Highland Avenue in Hollywood, old and young and Black and white and Hispanic and Asian. The Hollywood marches turned attention to Hollywood itself. Black actors and actresses became part of an initiative, Hollywood for Black Lives, and wrote a letter to the industry, quote, Hollywood has a privilege as a creative industry to imagine and create. We have significant influence over culture and politics. We have the ability to use our influence to imagine and create a much better world. Yet, historically and currently, Hollywood encourages the epidemic of police violence and culture of anti-Blackness. The way that Hollywood and mainstream media have contributed to the criminalization of Black people, the misrepresentation of the legal system, and the glorification of police corruption and violence have had dire consequences on Black lives, end quote. Across more than a century's timeline, it came to pass that the spiritual sons and daughters of Oscar Micheaux were still grappling with the weight of cinematic history, a history that had dived into the psyche of a segregated land with a potent force, creating storylines that its white arbiters deemed digestible to white audiences. Black artists have struggled since movies first began to grab hold of the storyline, investing when they could a more honest narrative. But even the most creative minds could not have imagined the potency of the films of slain victims of police brutality, seen by the entire world when movie theaters were shuttered because of a health pandemic. In their own way, those homemade films swept into the silt of a restless nation. It was as if there was a split screen, demanding of a nation that it look full on and unblinkingly at what it had done, good and bad, with the magic of its camera machinery, period.
Great. Yeah, excellent.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. I think you hit something where I can't hear you.
Oh, did I?
Okay, now you're back on.
I said I can't wait to read the whole book.
Oh, great.
I hope everybody who tuned in buys 4 or 5 copies and sends them to friends.
Thank you very much. It's been an honor, really, to be with you. I've enjoyed your films. I enjoy your current television work. In a real big way, I like to think this book is a love letter to you and all of the other filmmakers who have scaled the mountain.
It is indeed. And thank you for your Herculean effort.
Thank you very much.
And thank you both so much for that fantastic discussion. And thanks to everybody in the audience for joining us. Don't forget to buy your copy of Colorization in store or online at greenlightbookstore.com. The link is in the chat. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great night.
All right. Take
Bye-bye,
care,
everybody. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much.